Who were Europe's last pagans? Who were the last people to practice indigenous, traditional, polytheistic religions before Christianity conquered the continent? First, who were the last classical pagans, the last followers of the Greek and Roman gods who defined classical civilizations so deeply? Our search for these worshippers will take us to the very remotest corners of Greece and far beyond. Then we'll travel to the dark woods and frozen lakes of the Baltic, where we'll investigate Europe's last pagan state and how this pagan empire actually triumphed over its Christian foes. Finally, we'll travel to the very fingertips of the frozen north, a land of tundra and ice and mystic mutterings under the midnight sun. There, worship of one of world mythology's most iconic gods survived well into the modern period. So who were the first Greco-Roman pagans? Now, the answer to this blew my mind and was actually the whole reason I chose to make this video in the first place. So bear with me while we first establish a little bit of context. What did Greek and Roman pagans actually believe? Well, as ever, the answer is quite complicated. So you had local cults and gods, you had like the Lares, who were family, household spirits, but of course you have the classics, the big gods, Zeus, Jupiter, Poseidon, Neptune, Venus, or Aphrodite, these big public gods with their stone temples. You also have the paganism of the philosophers, who in the late Roman period were pretty mystical. There's quite a cerebral, transcendent type religion focusing on the one, a single god. This is called Neoplatonism, and we'll return to it in a moment. Some of these classic Olympian gods like Zeus or Poseidon, we know that these gods were being worshipped during Mycenaean times. That means by the time of the first Christian Roman emperor, Constantine, gods like Zeus and Poseidon had been worshipped for maybe as long as 2,000 years or more. So how, after such a long period of time, did they fall from grace? The repression of paganism was quite a drawn-out process and does begin with Constantine, who, while generally granting pagans toleration, did ban things like animal sacrifices. His reign commences Christianity's long march through the institutions of the Roman Empire. Christians were shown favoritism for jobs, and funding would increasingly go to churches instead of temples. Towards the end of the 4th century, you get some really romantic and heroic moments. For example, this moment where a pagan senator called Symmachus objected to the emperor Gratian removing the altar of the goddess Victory from the Senate house in Rome. Now, this statue and altar had been placed there by Caesar Augustus, the greatest Roman emperor, and this is what Symmachus had to say in its defense. "We ask then for peace for the gods of our fathers and of our country. It is just that all worship should be considered as one. We look on the same stars, the sky is common, the same world surrounds us. What difference does it make by what pains each seeks the truth? We cannot attain to so great a secret by one road." But the altar and statue of Victory were removed, and it's very clear that paganism was on the decline. In fact, the word pagan itself comes from the Latin paganus, meaning a kind of bumpkin, a redneck, a yokel. It was a term of insult, and it showed how paganism was increasingly confined to rural regions, to the margins of society. But in the 390s, this march of Christianity through the institutions becomes a sprint. Theodosius I makes public paganism illegal and shuts down the majority of temples. The Olympic Games themselves, this incredible unifying festival which had gone on for all of ancient Greek history, ends in 393. It's really abundantly clear now that paganism has become a taboo. But it does continue to exist until the final death knells really ring out in the reign of the Emperor Justinian in the 6th century. And in the year 529, Justinian closed the Neoplatonic Academy in Athens, ending a millennium of pagan philosophy in that city. In the 6th century, we find the very last named Greco-Roman pagans in all of history. The last one I can find is a guy called Olympiodorus the Younger, who was a philosopher in the city of Alexandria in Egypt. But when you read about him, you can see how much life force has been drained out of those old beliefs. His discussion of pagan myth and legend are seen as curiosities and kind of morbidly fascinating by his Christian students, but they're not seen as real, they're seen as artifacts of a glamorous and frightening past. And in his lifetime, the Temple of Isis at Philae in the far south of Egypt, possibly the very last pagan temple in the former Roman world, finally closed its doors, marking absolute victory for Christianity from Normandy to Nubia. And that would appear to be that, apart from an incredible reference in a Byzantine text some 4 100 years later. This is the manual of the Emperor Constantine VII, and it's from the 10th century AD. This blew my mind when I found it, and I'm just going to read the quote in full. The inhabitants of the city of Maina are not of the race of Slavs, but of the ancient Romans, and even to this day they are called Hellenes by the local inhabitants, because in the very ancient times they were idolaters and worshippers of images, after the fashion of the ancient Hellenes, and they were baptized in the reign of the glorious Basil. The place they live is waterless and inaccessible. So these people were baptized in the reign of Basil. Who is Basil? Well, this is Basil I. And do you want to know when he reigned? He reigned in the late 9th century AD. This is extraordinarily late. To give you some cultural touch points, this is the same time in which Alfred the Great is fighting the Vikings in England. It's half a century after Charlemagne sort of refounds the Roman Empire in the West. I mean, this time period is closer to the Crusades than it is to the reign of Justinian, who largely ended paganism in the East. How could this happen? Of course, the fact that this area, the Mani Peninsula, which is in the southern Peloponnese in Greece, is described as waterless and inaccessible. This gives us a good hint. I mean, it's just a very remote part of Greece, basically, and we can see that from much later periods. It was one of the epicenters of resistance to the Ottoman Empire in the 18th and 19th century. So this is a peninsula which was remote from authority anyway, and that isolation was massively increased in the period after Justinian's rule, where the Eastern Empire was rocked by Arab invasions and Slavic invasions. As the empire's grip over its subjects slackened, the paganism in the Mani Peninsula ostensibly carried on unmolested. While we have discovered churches in the Mani Peninsula from as early as the 4th century AD, it's clear that Christianity didn't reach everyone. But what really bums me out, and what's really upsetting to me, is that this single reference is all we have. So we can let our imaginations run wild. Did they sacrifice to Zeus and Poseidon and Athena, the old gods? Or was this actually a misunderstanding? Were they actually Christians or believed themselves to be Christians, but this was some sort of propaganda tool because Basil had some other reason to be mad at them? We don't really know. And that's what makes this such a tantalizing historical footnote. I'd really love to know more. But in some senses, paganism, at least the subtle, profound, abstract, transcendent beliefs of the Neoplatonist philosophers survived and was incredibly influential. We know that Neoplatonist philosophy impacted other pagan religions, like that of the moon cult of the god Sin in the city of Haran in Turkey. I mean, these cults survived into the 11th century. But more importantly, Neoplatonic belief influenced Islam and Christianity. And in the works of the great Christian mystics and Sufis, we find the legacy of men like Olympiodorus. Through these vehicles, pagan philosophy has survived to the present day. So that's classical paganism, but I'm sure many of you know there were far more variants of polytheistic religion than just what the Greeks and Romans believed. So let's change tact and jump forward from the 9th century, some 500 years, to the 14th century. We're going to see the end of Europe's very last pagan state. Now, we're in the Baltic Sea, and in this period it is teeming with commerce, with German merchant ships from the Hanseatic League, and if we pan downwards to the city of Riga, we see a classic medieval German town filled with archbishops and burghers, merchants, and then if we pan further south from there, we'll see farmsteads until we reach a massive fortified line of castles against a forested border. In these castles we see men wearing white cloaks with black crosses, the mark of a crusader. These are the Teutonic Knights, and beyond into this massive 90-mile wilderness, beyond that are their foes, the pagan Lithuanians. The Lithuanians rule over a heathen empire with air foul with the stench of animal sacrifice and blood being smeared over sacred rocks and the roots of oak trees. This Lithuanian empire would only convert to Christianity in the year 1387. Now, if you know your history, I mean, that's ridiculously late. It's about 4 centuries after the Vikings converted, for example. Well, like so many other polytheisms, Lithuanian paganism was extremely diverse. It was as various as the trees in the forest, but it was deeply rooted in nature. The Lithuanians worshipped the sun, they worshipped trees, they had sacred oaks and groves and worshipped by rivers. They tended to not have idols, so no wooden or stone statues of their gods, but rather found connection to their gods in these holy natural sites. And we can also see that in their reverence of special animals. They revered snakes very much and would actually keep sacred snakes among the cattle in their byres. But again, this heterogeneity is everywhere. I mean, a holy horse of the god Perkunas could be identified by being white in one region but black in another. And this god Perkunas was one of the chief gods for the Lithuanians. He was a sort of thunder storm god, very much like the Scandinavian Thor. Certain tribes of Lithuanians, like the Samogitians, who lived on the border with the Teutonic state, they apparently favoured the worship of an earthly underworld god over Perkunas. And while some Lithuanians buried their dead, still more practiced cremation. We get epic accounts of the cremation ceremonies of some of the Grand Dukes of Lithuania, whose bodies are, decked out in armour and splendour with grave goods for the afterlife, and then covered with fir pines and then set alight alongside their horses, their hawks, and some unfortunate slaves. It's worth saying that Lithuanian religion was extremely strong and vibrant and fervently held by people. It wasn't some insipid cult which was just sort of gradually waning in the face of Christianity, which was the, historically inevitable, powerful force. People really believed in this stuff. There are actually stories of Lithuanians who converted to Christianity who then threw off the new religion, and in doing so went to exhume the bodies of their loved ones, taking them out of the Christian graves and going to sacred groves in order to burn them and consign them to the Lithuanian paradise. It's actually reported that when the Samogitians would go raiding, they would then burn a third of everything they captured as an offering to their gods. And there was a lot of animal sacrifice in the religion, of pigs and sheep and bulls and even human beings. We know of two specific instances where Teutonic knight brothers were burned alive by the Lithuanians sitting atop their horses. But I think the question is, how did this religion survive for so long when all of the neighbouring tribes like the Prussians and the Livonians and the Estonians, they were all converted well before 1387. At the start of the 13th century, the Lithuanians looked very much like their neighbours. They were a scattered people split up into 20 different tribes. It's a great irony actually that Lithuanian paganism probably survived because of the actions of their first Christian king, a guy called Mindaugas. He managed to unite the Lithuanians using foreign influences like Christianity. He uses European-style seals, he used crossbows in his army. And geopolitics ended up favouring the Lithuanians, actually favouring Lithuanian religion to stay pagan. The Orthodox Russian cities hated the Teutonic Knights as well as hating the Mongols of the Golden Horde, and therefore the Lithuanians proved the lesser of a couple of evils and became a useful ally and even an overlord for them. And the Catholic powers found the Lithuanians useful too. I mean, in a dispute between the people of Riga and the Teutonic Knights in 1298, a pagan Lithuanian garrison was actually invited by the citizens of Riga to come and defend the city. They were useful mercenaries because if two Christian parties had sworn on the Bible to not attack each other, well, the Lithuanians didn't have to play by those rules and so could be hired by one party to attack the other without breaking any truce. And the thing is, Lithuanian religion continued to evolve. The Grand Duke Gediminas, he built a kind of pagan temple in Vilnius, one of the first of its kind, out of the ruins of the ruined Christian cathedral of Mindaugas. This temple had apparently a big idol of the god Perkunas and a sacred fire which should never go out. And because of the favourable geopolitics, the centralised state, and the fact that Lithuanian warriors were pretty formidable and beat up the Teutonic Knights many, many times, Lithuania could survive until in 1386 the Grand Duke Jogaila just got an incredible offer. He got the opportunity to marry the Queen of Poland and therefore add Poland to his realm, and the only price was converting to Christianity, and so he did. It was a price worth paying. It was on Lithuania's own terms that the conversion happened. The Teutonic Knights were of course robbed of their raison d'etre and said the conversion wasn't genuine, but after they were spanked in the Battle of Grunwald in 1410, Lithuania was victorious, and Poland-Lithuania would remain the dominant power in the region for the next 200 years. Now, of course, Lithuanian kings and dukes did go about converting people and building churches, but progress was very, very slow. In a treatise of 1547, the worship of Perkunas is still being condemned, implying that that god still had followers in Lithuania that late in history. And it's probable that the end of Lithuanian polytheism only truly came at some point in the 1600s, remarkably late. But even as the last fires of Perkunas went out in Lithuania in the 1600s, still more people were immersed in the worship of gods and spirits, the last of all Europe's pagans. So now we fly over the Baltic Sea, heading north past the prosperous trading cities of Helsinki and Stockholm, further north still, past the Norwegian town of Tromsø, right up into the subarctic. Here are the vast and craggy plains and mountains of Sápmi, the home of the Sami people, tending their herds of reindeer. Now the Sami are fascinating. They are a Uralic people, so they're related to the Finns and the Estonians. They're completely unrelated to the Germanic people of Scandinavia, you know, the Nordic folks, the Viking guys. Traditionally they were nomads, eking out life as hunter-gatherers and reindeer herders across the fantastically wild parts of northernmost Europe. In the Viking Age, the Sami were much respected and feared as expert magicians and witches, and because of their sort of peripheral presence in the Viking world, they had that kind of liminal quality, you know, ooh, spooky magic reindeer man. Something that appeals to me so much about the Sami religion is its animistic flavour. Now all of these polytheisms have this to an extent, but the Sami really believed that all rocks and trees and rivers, you know, even inanimate objects like stones, they had souls. They were animated with life. Central to the Sami religion are these guys called Noaidi. Noaidi. Let me Google this.
Noaidi.
Noaidi. Now, Noaidi were shamans, and they were quite extraordinary figures. Now, the main tool of the shaman was the drum, and these Sami drums were ubiquitous and are beautiful and just fascinating. They're covered in patterns, shapes of gods, of spirits, of animals, forces of the cosmos. What the drums were often used for were a divination tool. You know, basically you'd put stuff on the drum, for example, like maybe carving of a reindeer or something, and the guy would beat the drum, and then where the reindeer ended up would show what would happen, you know. Should we move our reindeer south or north or east? But the most exciting thing about the Noaidi is basically their ecstatic trances that they could get into. I mean, really fascinating. So they'd beat their drums, ba, 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 and they'd chant and dance and chant and basically get into a big ecstatic trance. And at the end of the sort of culmination of this, what this trance looked like is they drop their stuff and just face plant on the ground and just lie there like in a state of unconsciousness, semi-consciousness, face forward for hours. And during this time, their soul was supposed to be visiting the spirit realms, gathering information. One author specified that they never stayed in this trance for more than 24 hours, which to me implies that people were staying in it for like 20 hours. Which is amazing. Right, I've been driven inside because of the rain. I think Perkunas has got a vendetta against me because we started talking about the Sami and not Lithuania. Lithuania had their time, Perkunas. Please, bro. Poor man's thought. Yoiking is this other... I mean, this really is, I think, the most beautiful thing I've discovered in this whole video. It's a kind of like chanting that the Sami would do, that the shamans would do it when they before they went into their trances, but it was a more widely practice thing than that, and it just sounds beautiful. It sounds like Native American chanting, and it's really interesting. Here's a sample, by the way. Because this kind of religious song was suppressed by Christians for a long time because it was so associated with the old Sami religion. But luckily it's been revived by more modern generations of Sami. I think what's so interesting about it is that it's not like a narrative form of song. It doesn't really tell stories, as I understand it, about people or places. Instead, it evokes people or places directly. It doesn't describe them, it tries to sort of bring them alive. It tries to give an essence of the place through the song, through the sound. But here is the killer point which I teased in the introduction. There are fabulous connections between Sami religion and Old Norse Viking religion. So for example, you might know in Norse mythology they have this idea of Yggdrasil, the world tree, a giant tree which connects all these different realms, the realm of the gods, the realm of people, various like underworlds. The Sami had the same belief, but more interesting than that is a certain Sami god called Horageles, okay? You can see him painted on drums, and there he is. He is a sky god, a thunder god, and what is he holding there? He's holding two hammers. This is Thor. This is clearly the same god that the Scandinavians worshipped, the Vikings worshipped, and it is here, in northernmost Scandinavia, being worshipped in the 1700s. That is amazing. But of course, and it's so upsetting, Sami religion began to decline, and that really started in the 1500s, 1600s, when the Lutheran nations of Sweden and Denmark, Norway, they started sending missionaries to the furthest north. There was interest in these heathens at their doorstep, and clerics were sometimes very tolerant and friendly, but in many cases were extremely persecutorial, if that's a word. I mean, check this quote from a guy called Henrik Forbes, describing the Sami drum, the ritual center of their lives. "Oh, you confounded drum, tool and instrument of Satan. Cursed are your depicted gods. Each beat that is made on you is and will be Satan's beat in hell." You've got to remember the 1500s and 1600s, these were those frightful witch-hunting centuries. Dozens of Sami were burned for witchcraft. A totemic and very upsetting case comes from 1687, and it involved a guy called Lars Nilsson, who was a kind of Sami shaman. Basically, what happened was Lars's either son or grandson, just a 6-year-old boy, had fallen into a well and drowned. And so Lars, in his grief, and in his hope to restore the boy, did a little ritual. He carved some idols of various gods, and he beat on his drum and tried to perform a little ceremony over the dead child, and then was discovered by Christian neighbours. At his trial, Lars Nilsson was defiant. He expressed his faith in the old ways, and for it he was beheaded and burned. But the relentless missionary work, the power of the Scandinavian states, over time it ground away Sami traditional beliefs. The great Noaidi, the people who could actually enter these ecstatic trances, they had disappeared by the 1800s. And so it was probably at some point in the 1700s, perhaps the 1770s, when traditional Sami beliefs finally breathed their last. But I mean, think about that. The 1770s. This is the decade of the American Revolution. It's the decade of Captain Cook arriving in Australia. People with indigenous, polytheistic, animistic beliefs still worshipped in Europe in that decade, although it was to be their last. And in conclusion, I can't be the only one who kind of romanticizes these old beliefs. From the grand speeches of Lysimachus to imagining medieval Mani or Lithuanian blood magic or the ecstatic trances of a Sami shaman, I mean, it's all just so wonderfully colourful. And because of that, it's easy to begrudge the victory of Christianity. It feels like the felling of all of these beautiful sprouts and trees of all these different religions, and Christianity comes through like a scythe and just replaces all of it with a single god, a single symbol. But that isn't fair, really. Christianity is diverse in its own way, and if I'm honest with myself, I probably am more comfortable with the God of the Bible and the loving message of a Jesus than I am with altars of the goddess Victory or Lithuanian priests up to their elbows in ox blood. Yet still, whenever we encounter these old beliefs which served their worshippers for millennia, we inevitably find wisdom. Pagan insight that the whole world and every part of it is teeming with life and beauty and horror it's profound. And the idea that an animal or a tree might have deep inherent worth, that not only humans were built in God's image, I think there's a deep sense of connection we can find in such an idea, and it's not half-wise. But all I can say is I have loved learning about these awesome religions. Perhaps in the same way a future historian will love learning about our different sects and beliefs and marvel at our dynamism and strangeness, lamenting whatever fate awaits us and our belief systems in the near or perhaps distant future. Thanks for watching.